So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are live across multiple continents and a number of different time zones. And I'm very excited about our opportunity to do this. My name is George Lehner. I'm the chairperson of the Fund for Peace. And on behalf of our board of directors and the fund and our staff, and a number of whom are with us virtually today, I want to welcome you all to the 16th annual launch of the Fragile State Index. We're doing this virtually, as I said. It is a challenge, but it's a great opportunity as well, I think, to more broadly engage and to add to an important global conversation about fragility and resilience, and ultimately about peace building. You know, one of the questions that we are often asked when we publish the index is, why do we measure the fragility of all the 170 plus nation states? Why not focus only on the most fragile, the most at risk, the top 50, for example? I think the answer should be very clear now. If nothing else, we now know that we are all fragile. Indeed, there are many, many lessons that can be learned from the current corona pandemic, but we certainly know to some degree and to some measure that we are all fragile, we are all vulnerable, all to different degrees to be sure, but we know there is resilience as well. As you will hear today, our 2020 index does not reflect the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, but what it does do is provide a snapshot of the state of the world immediately preceding the corona pandemic. And this is, and I believe it will be, a very important data set as we move forward and ultimately assess the impact of corona in the years ahead across regions and various states and locales. So this comes, I believe, at a very opportune time. Let me, before we begin our panel discussion today, and first I will welcome our panel, they'll all be introduced, but thank you all for participating today very much. Let me say a brief word about the Fund for Peace. For over 60 years, the Fund for Peace has been a world leader in developing practical tools and approaches for reducing conflict around the globe. We use data-driven tools to empower policymakers, practitioners, and local populations with what we believe are context-specific applications to diagnose risks and vulnerabilities and to develop solutions through collective dialogue. Just very quickly, for a specific example, we have most recently been working on the ground throughout West Africa in collaboration with ECOWAS to establish conflict early warning and assessment teams throughout the West Africa region. We have worked with local peace building organizations to develop gathering, visual mapping, and analytical tools to help local communities in various locales identify and address areas of violence against women and girls. Much of what we do begins with the methodology we use to build the Fragile State Index, and we are very proud of this effort. And I would encourage anybody who's listening today to please go to our website, use the index. It's interactive, it's designed to be available and open. And if you want to learn even more, please feel free to contact us. We're always happy to talk to you about what we do. Now, if I may, let's begin our official program. First, by introducing two colleagues who will present the results of this year's 2020 Fragile State Index. First, let me introduce JJ Mesner de la Tour, who is the Executive Director of the Fund for Peace. This is the 10th year that JJ has been involved in presenting the FSI. JJ has, over the years, become a leader in the peace building field, particularly in the area of human rights and security, and he serves as a board member of the Voluntary Principles in Human Rights and Security. We're also going to hear from our colleague Charles Fiertz. Charles is our program manager, focusing on conflict early warning and analysis programs. He graduated summa cum laude from St. Mary's College and holds a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. And finally, we want this program to be as interactive as possible, and I want to remind you that you can send questions via the website at www.fragilestateIndex.org/ask or on Twitter with FSI 2020, hashtag FSI 2020. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to JJ, and again, thank you all for participating today. JJ.
Wonderful, and thank you to George for your opening remarks and continued support. And welcome to all of you for attending the first ever online launch of the Fragile States Index. I'm joining you from Alexandria, Virginia, though frankly I could be joining you from anywhere. These are unique, challenging times. Of course, we would love for you to all be joining us in person, but thank you for joining us online. I would also like to thank the multinational staff of the Fund for Peace in our various locations in Washington and Accra, Abuja, and Tunis, and in particular Charles Fietz for making the Fragile States Index possible. Before going any further, I would like to begin with what is perhaps the elephant in the room, and that is COVID-19. We're all affected in some way, and I'm sure we're all anxious about our own health, the health of our loved ones, and what the future holds. And later on, our expert panel will be delving into broader concepts of resilience and will no doubt speak to the current pandemic and how we can monitor, plan, prepare, mitigate, and respond to the next one. But for now, I can tell you that we will not be covering COVID-19 as part of the 2020 Fragile States Index, since its true impact did not occur during the index sample period that ended on December 31st. And for some of you who are experiencing COVID-19 fatigue, perhaps that will come as an enormous relief. This is because an annual index, by definition, is retrospective. By the time the numbers are crunched, the data is analyzed, and all the fancy graphics are published, something new and unexpected may have taken place. But this phenomenon is hardly new. Indeed, it has happened before. Nearly a decade ago, the 2011 Fragile States Index was published just as Middle Eastern and North African nations were in the grips of the Arab Spring. The FSI assessment period for the preceding year had closed only 13 days after Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, set himself on fire in response to police abuse, igniting an Arab Spring that would consume wide swaths of North Africa and the Middle East. The FSI was released with barely a register of the revolutions to come, just as the eyes of the world were focused on mass protests spreading rapidly across the region. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, there is a bit of a sense of deja vu for the FSI, as the crisis that currently grips the world is not explicit in the current FSI data. However, this is not to say that the FSI tells us nothing about the present nor the future. The utility of data sets such as the FSI is not found in simply reflecting the headlines back to us. Rather, it is the long-term trends of the FSI that are uniquely helpful in guiding policymakers and implementers on understanding where risk exists and is increasing, or where quiet, steady improvement is marching forward. Looked at in this way, the index can be used to shed light on the context in which a crisis, such as the Arab Spring, the COVID-19 pandemic, or any other shock or potential emergency might take place. In a situation of high demographic pressures, for example, how will the country manage the extra stress on their health system? In a situation of high group grievance, how will society mobilize the necessary collective effort to respond? But more fundamentally, when we talk about state fragility, what is it that we actually mean? There are many and varied definitions of a fragile state. According to the OECD, a state is fragile when it is unable or unwilling to perform the functions necessary for poverty reduction, the promotion of development, protection of the population, and the observance of human rights. In other words, fragility occurs where the state is unable to perform basic functions in the areas of security, rule of law, and basic social services. We would also add to that the inability for collective and inclusive decision-making. Furthermore, fragile states are unable to develop constructive and interactive relationships with their own populations and with other countries. Regardless of definition, for people living in most fragile states, their lives can be beset by poverty, inequality, violence, displacement, and often oppression. Fragile states are also vulnerable ones. Where shocks occur, be they natural or man-made, they can be especially vulnerable, lacking the capacity or capability to absorb or adapt to those shocks. Worse still, fragility, poverty, and violence form a vicious cycle. When state structures are weak and it is no longer possible to guarantee basic public services or to provide security, conflicts often escalate. It is only through the development of legitimate institutional capacity and an active civil society that this vicious cycle can be broken. But how do you measure fragility? Firstly, we need to recognize that all countries, as George mentioned and alluded to in his opening remarks, all countries experience some level of social, economic, and political pressure. What differentiates countries is their relative level of fragility versus their resilience or capacity to respond to shocks. But when does a risk become a crisis? Where should we be focusing our efforts? Where is there improvement and where should we be worried? These are key questions in seeking to respond to fragility. We need to know the specific context, the ability to withstand or respond to shocks or crises, specific social, economic, and political trends, and the dynamic drivers of risk. These issues require quantitative metrics on areas that are fundamentally qualitative in nature. It is relatively straightforward to measure infant mortality, or GDP, or kilometers of road. But how do you measure rule of law, or group grievance, or factionalized elites? Fragility also requires discussions and judgments on issues that are often politically sensitive. How do you ensure objectivity of analysis? Basically, what we need is monitoring and evaluation for countries. And to explain how we do that, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Charles Fearts, to talk about the methodology that is underlying the Fragile States Index. Charles.
Thanks, JJ. And thanks for that overview. So I'm going to discuss the nuts and bolts of how we produce the scores that we released this week without, hopefully, getting too lost in the weeds. But first, I want to take a step back to briefly touch on how the FSI was first created. The FSI is based on the CAST framework, or the Conflict Assessment System Tool framework. The CAST framework was developed in the 1990s by FFB, Georgetown University, and the Peacekeeping and Stabilization Operations Institute as a field-level tool for policymakers and practitioners. Its purpose was to understand and measure conflict drivers and dynamics in complex environments. By 2005, when the then failed States Index was developed and first published in Foreign Policy magazine, the CAST framework had been in use for some years, and the lessons learned during that time were incorporated into the FSI. This is one of the unique aspects of the FSI, that at its roots, at its very foundation, it is based on practical, applied learning in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Unlike many indices, which are created de novo and then applied to a given problem, the FSI was essentially created in reverse. An existing, proven framework was re-engineered to form the backbone of the index. While the CAST framework serves as that foundation of the FSI, the volume of data that needs to be processed and analyzed when assessing 178 countries across 12 indicators every year required the development of a new methodological approach. This approach, which is the one that we continue to use today, rests on three streams of information: quantitative data, content analysis, and qualitative review. Quantitative data encompasses pre-existing datasets, generally, but not exclusively, from international and multilateral institutions, such as the World Bank and the United Nations. This data is normalized and then aggregated into sub-indicators, which are then combined into the 12 FSI indicators. Within each of these sub-indicators, there are individual components. For example, natural disasters, which is a sub-indicator of demographic pressures, includes things like hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. The content analysis stream assesses the prevalence of many of these individual components in global media coverage. We use a content aggregator, which covers over 10,000 English language sources, which together account for between 40 and 50 million articles and reports per year. These assessments of how prevalent earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and other individual components are controlled for baseline coverage. The idea that countries like the US or the UK will pretty much always have many more articles than countries like Fiji or Vanuatu. The final of the three streams that goes into the FSI is qualitative review. And what this means is that each country is reviewed independently by two analysts across all 12 indicators to assess year-on-year trends based on key events from the preceding 2 years. This review helps us capture major occurrences that may possibly have been overlooked by the quantitative data and the content analysis. Once we collect the information from these three streams, it's then integrated using a consistent set of rules to produce 2,136 scores, namely the 12 indicator scores for each of the 178 countries that we cover. The final step in the process is a panel review by our research team. Now we know that all three streams have their strengths, of course, but they also have their weaknesses. For example, quantitative data can be lagging or incomplete, content analysis can be noisy, and while our integration process aims to maximize the strengths of each type of data while minimizing their weaknesses, it's still possible to miss things. To that end, the panel review aims to catch false positives and false negatives, which means scores that change despite no major change in underlying conditions, or vice versa, scores that don't change despite significant changes in the underlying conditions. And I think an example may really help illustrate what I mean by this. A few years ago, there was a country whose demographic pressure score was worsening significantly, but we couldn't figure out why. We couldn't see anything reflected in the information that any of us had. After some careful review, we discovered that the content analysis was showing a high prevalence of landslides, though we really didn't see this reflected anywhere else, and were therefore, a little perplexed as to why this was happening. As it turned out, that country had had an election, and the content analysis had confused natural disaster with an overwhelming victory, widely reported as a landslide victory. Therefore, we tweaked our content analysis parameters to avoid this kind of mixed up problem, both that year and going forward. So while the basic methodology of the FSI remains constant, we are careful to ensure that it is constantly learning and adapting to provide the most accurate scores possible. Now, before I hand it back to JJ to talk about this year's results, I want to take a moment to zoom out a little bit. What are the most important components of the FSI? First is the integration of multiple types of data with different strengths. For example, content analysis helps integrate current events into our index rather than relying purely on quantitative datasets, which often lag the present by multiple years. Despite their lag, however, that quantitative data does often provide a very firm, more objective foundation for the index, particularly as many metrics, for example, available arable land or literacy rates, change only very slowly and are still relevant even with the lag of a few years. The second most important component of the FSI is a consistent methodology. Not only have the 12 indicators stayed the same through the entire life of the index, we have tried to keep the underlying methodology as consistent as possible. Now, sometimes changes are needed on the margin. Perhaps a data set stops being updated, or perhaps the content analysis parameters need tweaking. But we do try and avoid making major changes to the core process. The third important component is its widespread usage. We're really proud of the extent to which the index is used. The FSI is used as a key metric by a wide array of different stakeholders, including national governments, institutions, the private sector, NGOs, academia, and more, to inform policymaking, as well as researching, studying the impacts of state fragility. We're further encouraged by the inclusion of the FSI as a metric within the new US Global Fragility Act. Finally, I would like to reiterate the earlier call for everyone to visit the FSI's website, fragilestatesindex.org, where you can find all of our data, as well as many fancy interactive graphics, as well as the My FSI app that allows you to play with the weightings of the 12 different indicators to fulfill whatever specific need you might have. And with that, to talk about the major findings of this year's index, I would like to hand it back to JJ.
Thank you, Charles, for that overview. I also want to make a point of recognizing the work that Charles has done to modernize the Fragile States Index and really turn it into something that is incredibly efficient and effective. Now to the major findings of the 2020 Fragile States Index. There is always the temptation to look at the top and the bottom of the index. From that perspective, there has been little change since last year. Yemen again ranks as the most fragile country by virtue of its ongoing civil war that has escalated into a humanitarian disaster. Meanwhile, at the other end of the FSI, Finland has again ranked as least fragile for the 8th year in a row. But interestingly, this year we have ranked fewer countries in the very high alert category and more countries in the very sustainable bracket. We are seeing a general upward trend across the board. Only 21 out of 178 countries were found to be worse off this year than they were last year. That is to say that 88% of countries improved on their previous year's score, even if only incrementally. Up until the end of 2019, the FSI data was demonstrating that, broadly speaking, the world is becoming less fragile. That improvement also points to a key facet of how to understand and utilize the FSI. As much as it is interesting to look at the rankings, I would argue that it is not the most useful aspect of the index. Though it might be helpful to know the levels of relative fragility in various countries across standard indicators, ultimately, the real utility of this analysis is comparing countries against themselves over time. The most worsened country since last year is Chile. This is a remarkable turnaround for a country that had otherwise been demonstrating steady gains to previously rank within the 30 most stable countries on the index. However, recent protests over economic and social inequality, met with heavy-handed government responses, highlighted underlying vulnerabilities that had served to undermine the durability of Chile's recent improvements. Two countries tied for second most worsened country since last year. First, Libya, which also rates as the most worsened country in the last decade on the FSI, continued its slide due to the ongoing civil war and battle for control of the country. Second, Mozambique, which also rates as the sixth most worsened country over the past decade of the FSI, worsened as a result of severe natural disasters that exposed the country's long unaddressed vulnerabilities. This was compounded by renewed conflict in the north of the country. Among the other most worsened countries for 2020, Burkina Faso and Mali saw a continuation of conflict and violence that has racked each of those countries for a prolonged period. Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela witnessed political instability and questionable leadership. Colombia's peace agreement continued to unravel. The Bahamas were hit by natural disaster, and India and Cameroon saw increased repression of and violence against minority groups. Another notable case was the United Kingdom, which continued its long-term worsening trend as Brexit reached its crescendo, leaving the country to rate as the seventh most worsened on the index. Meanwhile, the most improved country in 2020 is the Maldives, which continued a long-term trend of near constant improvement that has seen the country move from being ranked 66th in 2007, when it was first included in the FSI, to 99th in 2020. Three countries, Sudan, Iraq, and Kenya, tied for second most improved country in 2020, all improving from previous bouts of conflict, instability, and repression. But by no means should any of these three countries be considered as necessarily more stable. After all, they rank 8th, 17th, and 29th respectively on the FSI. However, such gains should be cause for cautious optimism and representative of tentative steps on a positive path. More useful still than year-on-year changes are the longer-term trends. Over the long term, the most worsened countries of the past decade come as no surprise, as Libya, Syria, Mali, Yemen, and Venezuela have continued to unravel amidst varying levels of protracted conflict and instability. Though it would be easy to assume that the most worsened countries of the FSI are either less developed or the scene of conflict, or both, the top 20 most worsened since 2010 includes the United Kingdom and the United States, both of which have experienced years of tumultuous politics and social division. Unlike the most worsened countries, the most improved over the past decade have not been headline grabbers, as countries like Cuba, Georgia, Uzbekistan, and Moldova have made quiet, consistent improvement over time. Though it must be viewed within the broader context that it is more likely that a country is able to make significant gains if its starting point is well behind that of its peers. It is therefore likely no accident that six of the 10 most improved are former Soviet states. Looking forward to 2021, though COVID-19 did not have any discernible impact on the 2020 Fragile States Index, there is little doubt that next year's FSI will be dominated by the social, economic, and political fallout of the pandemic. It is highly likely that some of the countries most heavily impacted so far, such as China, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, Brazil, and Russia, will register significantly increased pressure. As the impacts of the pandemic, both direct and indirect, filter through the global system, it is equally likely that much of the world will be affected, more so should the crisis worsen, or if there are additional waves of the pandemic in months to come. Nevertheless, it will be important in the longer term to understand the deeper societal vulnerabilities that the crisis has uncovered, and the data will be critical in being able to tell that story soberly and coherently. We trust that the Fragile States Index will provide helpful data that allows us to understand how we recover from the current crisis, and perhaps more importantly, plan and prepare for the inevitable next crisis. At this point, I would like to hand over to Obi, Senior Editor at our media partner, The New Humanitarian, to begin our panel discussion.
Welcome everybody to this panel discussion in this new normal of Zoom meetings. I'm glad we're all going for a kind of Spartan anonymous look. I was toying with the idea of wallpaper, the collected works of Dickens behind me. I'm also happy to note that when JJ's camera panned down, he's actually wearing trousers, which is, we're fortunate to notice that. The FSI has been a kind of a staple for many journalists. I've been a fan for quite a while, and at TNH we're very honored to be part of this launch. I've got a very, very easy job. It's just to get out of the way and introduce some excellent panelists who are going to talk through the idea of the database approaches to global crises. With us today is Christine Pathmore. Christine is Chief Executive Officer of the Council on Strategic Risks. Eric Sariot is a Senior Health Systems Strengthening Advisor for Save the Children. We also have Nancy Wilson, the President of and Chief Executive Officer of Relief International, and Nate Haken, the Program Director at FPP. So basically what we'll do is for the next 20 or so minutes, we'll go through a series of questions. We'll also encourage people who want to tweet in to please do so, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions as possible. We want it to be a light, informative discussion. And if anybody wants to jump in on the panel, just raise your hand. We'll pass over to you. But if you're all ready, if I can ask Nate the first question, and that's when a crisis hits, everything gets really, really messy in terms of reliable and actionable data. And can a retrospective index like FSI help with response planning for a major humanitarian crisis?
Thanks so much, Obi. Yeah, that's a tough question. In terms of the data and the limitations of the data, especially in the middle of a crisis, data, as you say, gets very messy very fast. Data tends to be laggy. It tends to be noisy, it's just hard to know how to use data in a way that can be very practical for response planning. As Charles was talking about, even in the case of the Fragile States Index, which isn't looking at a specific crisis, is looking more long-term retrospectively, even then the data is noisy. So content analysis is good at looking at dynamic changes, while it's also very bad at comparing one country to the other without being very careful about how you use the data. So, sorry, let me just look at my notes here. So you've got to be careful and very thoughtful about how you aggregate, scale, and triangulate the data. And you have to be very clear and transparent about your assumptions and your parameters. But you can't let yourself get paralyzed. A lot of times people, when the data isn't perfect, they throw the data away and then they say, well, you can't do anything about it. You don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect data set. You've got to be a bit of an alchemist, looking for proxies and filling gaps by extrapolating from regressions, using incomplete data sets, and using qualitative methods for ground truthing and qualifying and contextualizing the data, and then interpreting based on your clearly articulated assumptions. So these are the challenges when it comes to using data for response planning. You've also got to be very clear about what your tool is trying to do. Is it trying to be an early warning tool? Is it trying to be a planning tool? Is it trying to be a diagnostic tool? So these are all the questions that that you have to struggle with when using data for response planning. A retrospective tool is good at telling you things about pre-existing conditions. For example, you know, whether those pre-existing conditions are social, economic, political, or what have you. It doesn't tell you much about what disease or what shock is going to hit which country or when, but it should tell you something about how a country might perform if a given shock does strike.
Great, thanks, Nate. Nancy, with your experience at Relief International, humanitarian interventions tend to be pro forma checklists, metrics, and timelines, and usually can be quite slow to adapt to the environment and the political economy, that kind of context. Can sort of on the ground human intervention try and help mold that interpretation of the data? Is that something of real value?
Thank you for the question, Obi. I wanted to step back for a moment to one of Nate's comments about the data and whether it's useful for planning and going forward in this kind of an environment. And I think some of the data in here is really helpful, even up at the sort of aggregated level. The three numbers that jumped out to us are the indicators around group grievance. It tells us a lot about the sort of decision-making mechanisms and that people are going to be included or not included, something to think about when you're thinking about a response. The other is uneven development, also telling you that there are going to be some people really on the margins of economic viability, and wherewithal. And the third one is public services. Even places that have public services, we've seen the amount of pressure that the COVID pandemic has put on those public services. So it tells us that there are going to be some very weak, in some places, no referral pathways, say, for medicine, because there's no healthcare system in which to refer people. And in other places that there's going to be just a lot of pressure on those governmental services, and do they really have the ability to stand them up and keep them standing over time? So I think there's a lot in there that really helps us think, and with each country, what do we need to adapt? Well, Relief International is definitely a humanitarian organization. We're also not a just stand up, rush in, and then rush back out organization. So we're in fragile settings for the long haul. And in that context, you end up doing both the sort of service provision of humanitarian work, which is essential when public services aren't strong, and the capacity building work of development, so that over time you're building the resilience and the capacity of communities and systems to be able to respond. So we're doing both of those things, and definitely having the metrics to know what's the status of public services in the country at the time, and where are the vulnerable populations, how much of that disconnection exists in a country, really help us understand how we need to enter into a country and plan our services.
Well, that idea of Christine, of vulnerable communities, I mean, we tend to see data as neutral, but we do know it is deeply political. We've seen that in algorithms collected by some police departments, but also there's a problem of the uncounted, who are kind of marginalized, who don't appear in the data. I mean, any ideas how we can try and address this kind of problem?
Well, there are no silver bullets on that, but I think just recognizing that that comes into what we're looking at is super important. So one of the things that in our work we're constantly vigilant of is looking at the sort of status and change over time in fragility and resilience in countries that have nuclear weapons, for example, or nuclear materials that might become at risk if conflict ensued or instability took over certain parts of their countries. For there, you always have to recognize that there's significant information gaps that you're going to have, but that doesn't make the data that you do have any less useful. You just have to recognize going in that for certain countries, especially where free press is incredibly limited, and other hindrances come into data collection on the upfront, that you need to do a lot of ground truthing. You need to talk to people as much as possible where you're at or where you're working, or people who live there. And you need to have conversations with people who might know things that are never going to appear in public sources in a more robust way. I think that's incredibly important for preventing surprises and things like that. You just have to recognize that that gap is there. But again, it doesn't make these tools any less useful. So it's still a starting point for people like me and the work that I do. When I'm looking at some of the types of threats that we cover at the Council, this is sort of one of those constant steady state tools, is to go look at indices like the FSI, even if it's retrospective, and get that sense across social and economic and political and other indicators of what's the sort of baseline situation and how's it trending in each of these countries. It also takes us out of our stovepipes to look at things like the FSI in the work that we do. So in fields like affairs, we tend to really dig into our sort of technical issues at hand. And sometimes we all have a tendency to lose the bigger picture. One of the things I love about FSI is that, again, it allows you to step back and get that more holistic sense of how individual countries and regions are doing and what the trend lines are, and then go in and look at some of the things that Nancy was indicating, for example, are really useful in her work. The collection over time of these specific data points on some of the trends that we think have some of the biggest correlations with conflict, for example, or tensions between two specific countries. The richness of being able to go in and kind of get those data and what those trends look like is incredibly helpful. Again, even knowing that there are going to be blind spots in these things, still indispensable to have data like this collected, especially in a longitudinal way.
Erica, over to you. I was idly Googling you, as you do. Sorry, I don't mean to sound creepy, but I noticed the paper that you've done on unlocking community capabilities, and that whole idea of social capital seems to be there's greater recognition of the role it can play, and I think the FSI is trying to capture some of that as well. What are your thoughts on this? Does it kind of skew the idea of fragility, that we do have these kind of social networks which are strong even in some of the weaker states that we notice?
Probably need to unmute. Yes, so thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, yeah, social capital, relationships. I mean, I'm a bit more in the weeds than some of, the co-panelists here. I tend to be navigating between programs and research, mostly in health. So it's fantastic to be looking across the board at, more multi-dimensional issues. And you try to aggregate the data. I mean, Charles described it, but there's kind of almost a fractal reality of country. I mean, I'm looking at your, the indicators, the fractioning, the fractionalized, elites and so forth. It can happen at national level, and that's clearly what you see in the news, right? That's what dominates. But then it can happen all the way down to very local level, and we know that the issues of equity, who gets left behind, are very, critical in advancing, social goods. And so, in a way, I think programs are, they need, everything we do in terms of system strengthening. That's what I focus on, system strengthening. Context is king. So we need to understand the context. And I think a tool like this can be very useful in kind of providing a snapshot, but not just that, maybe spending more time diving into, the determinants of that context, what gives you a high or a low score, what gives you a changing trend, asking questions about numbers. I think numbers are more about asking us questions and giving final answers. But then when you get down to the local level, you see a lot of current efforts, like a lot of the things I'm involved currently with SAVE and, other organization, WHO, etc. We're looking a lot at social accountability, which is maybe a contribution to social capital you're asking about. And what's very interesting is that there also is a use of data. Like the most famous, reference that people have for social accountability is building community scorecards. So you have scorecards about the services you're referring, and usually they're, facilitated. I mean, NGOs have a major role in that, but now we see more and more government engagement and multilateral support. But it's usually seen as a tool to build equity. But the way it happens is really a way by using data, again, to get people to talk together. So one of the, we tend to be an organization you know, I like to say, I'm not sure other people agree, but I like to say we're an organization where our know-how, our place is we get different people to sit around the table and talk together. That's the main thing we know how to do. Of course, I'll get heckled for that, but I really think that is. And then data can be, you know, that can be a community scorecard, that can be a participatory assessment, that can be hard data, which is going to bring the decision makers, the local government, the health officials, or even the health facility manager who may be under some sort of performance-based financing and paying a lot of attention to indicators. So you can take different indicators, as Nate was saying, then it is messy. But if you're able to use that to create a dialogue, to create sense making, then you have a chance to change the drivers of the individual indicators. But there's a lot of spillover, and it's very hard to keep things in a box and say, okay, this is the indicators, this is the problem, and we're going to have this outcome. What we find out when we look at it through the lens of systems is that once you get people to look at the metrics, and they don't have to be perfect, but they have to be meaningful. And the job of us professionals, and locally and you know, globally, if we support our colleagues doing the real work, our job is to try to make the indicators as reliable. You know, JJ was saying, you know, we can measure mortality or measles coverage, but then there's all these other things that are going to be fuzzy and hard to measure. But the sense making that you get out of having the different people around the table can be critical. And as you create sense together, which is not necessarily total consensus, you do build some social capital, and that plays to integration, that plays to equity, that plays to building norms. So it's interesting to me to contrast a very big macro, you know, scan that you're doing with the FSI, and, you know, who is it going to talk to? Who's going to make sense about it? Who's going to dive in and ask the questions? And who's going to, you know, have a tug of war about it with what we do at much lower levels? I mean, we also do it, you know, of course, you know, we have policy engagement and things like this, but, you know, it's interesting to me to see how this navigates the scales from national level to local. And yes, social capital, people talking together, people making sense. I mean, a lot of the time, I mean, if you look at even at countries that are doing well, you know, you look at my native country, France, you know, which, you know, there's a lot of inability to talk even about data. So this trust, this not just trust in experts, but trust in the things that we communicate together, and the value of data seems to be very important in that part.
I think, Nate, I think that's the kind of question that we should flip to you. I mean, I think everybody's thinking about COVID-19. I think the takeaway from previous FSIs was that we should all be Scandinavian. But do you think with COVID-19 for next year, that might throw a bit of a spanner in the works? It might be harder to spot a winner?
These are really interesting questions. One of the things that we noticed, speaking of this issue of social capital, is that over the last, let's see, since 2008, there has been a marked deterioration across the world's democracies when it comes to those indicators which speak most directly to the question of social capital, which is group grievance and factionalized elites. And certainly we see that, you know, in the United States, where, you know, media consumption is almost maximally partisan. It just becomes very, very difficult to mobilize any kind of collective action to address the deepest, most sort of fundamental structural problems that we face, whether that's, you know, inequality or climate change, or in this case, you know, a global pandemic where there's just controversy over almost every fact of the case becomes partisan and controversial. And we see this in a lot of the world's democracies, this deterioration in social capital. And that's partly maybe, you know, due to some of the global shocks that we've faced over the last decade or so, whether that be the 2008 financial crisis, which led to more populism and or whether that be refugee, mass migration and refugee crises, or other global, shocks that have served to divide us, which makes it that much more difficult to address something like COVID-19, where it really does take strong social capital, almost more than it takes money and resources. It takes social capital to be able to, mobilize the collective action, which means individuals need to be able to be willing to make their sacrifices for the greater good. So looking at 2020 and thinking about how COVID-19 is going to further impact on these long-term trends, it's worrying, to see how it seems to have even further divided us up until now. These trends might continue. On the other hand, maybe it'll be a wake-up call and people will start to, coalesce, and the social capital will improve. The way we've seen it in West Africa after Ebola, where the memory of Ebola has created an opportunity for stronger social capital in countries like Liberia, for example. So these are really interesting times. And when we think about FSI 2021, what are we going to see? And it'll be very interesting.
Right. Nancy, just back to you on that issue of noisy data, difficult to understand data. I mean, what are some of the best practices you found for making decisions in that kind of context where there's uncertainty, as we're seeing, who knows what the ramifications of COVID-19 is going to be, but where data is absent, messy, unreliable, changing too quickly to get a real bead on it?
Changing is certainly a big deal for us, and that even the donor rules that you used to be able to count on are changing from week to week, or they become uncertain. They just say, we'll be coming out with a policy, we're not sure what it is. And so you've got to carry forward with a lot of contingency planning. But there are some things we can control, and I think, right, that's how you keep serene, is you figure out what can you control and what can you do with those pieces. So for instance, Eric was talking about community scorecards and the like, and we most of us in the humanitarian development community do some kind of accountability to communities, asking the communities, how are we doing? Well, we've actually now flipped that question. And instead of doing outreach where we say, how are we doing? We say, how are you doing? And use it as an opportunity to check out how people are doing in all the ways that COVID could be affecting them. How's their health? How's their livelihood? How's their safety? Those are sort of the three things that we want to find out so that we can then figure out where our programming needs to fit in. I think in the Western world, in the North, the trajectory of the pandemic has been disease, then economy, right? You see the disease coming, it starts up, and then the economy shuts down. The shutting down of the economies in the North has already had an effect on countries in the South where the pandemic hasn't even hit yet. They've lost their remittances, they're losing their jobs that are in the global supply chain. So they are hungry and they are, desperate at that level. And you need to start addressing those things. And yet all the attention is on, are you going to be ready with PPE in your healthcare centers? So we're seeing a very different sort of sequencing or waves of impact in other places. And that's the data that we know. We know that families are already in trouble, that the economies are already they were not in good shape to begin with. I mean, we specialize in fragile settings. We're in 16 countries, 3 of which are in the top 4 of the Fragile States Index. In fact, our 3 biggest countries are Yemen, Syria, and South Sudan. So, this is very real economic collapse that's happening. So we look at the data on the ground and find out that really it's the economy, it's food security that is going to be the most pressing health issue well before COVID-19 becomes a health issue.
The communication gods have so far been favorable. Hope it continues that way. In about 10 minutes, we'll switch to questions from the audience. But before that, Christine, can I turn to you about that idea of resilience? That it's a key factor in keeping countries from becoming vulnerable to risk and conflict, but also in terms of their recovery. I mean, resilience is such a meaty word, but how do you identify resilience, especially in countries in conflicts, in the midst of humanitarian emergencies? What are some of the crucial ingredients?
Sure, and I would say this is a grand question that all of us who think about these things are still grappling with, how to actually measure resilience. In the more security community side of things, I can say we always underestimate it pretty universally. We tend to be worst case scenario planners by nature, those of us sort of in the defense and security side of things. And there is a good area to, I think, continue improving. This is one area where data can also be misleading if we're measuring the wrong things. So very often resilience is, we think about it in terms of dollars spent in certain ways and things like that. But I think as some of the other speakers have indicated with their remarks, a lot of resilience comes down to social things, less so dollars and whatnot, but whether you're a wealthy nation or a developing nation or whatever the conditions are, one of the big ingredients that you need to look for is whether or not people trust the governments or whoever is providing services. Very often as well, when governments are not providing significant resilience, that leaves a vacuum that can be filled by other actors. Sometimes those actors are humanitarian organizations doing wonderful work. Other times they're terrorist organizations or subnational groups that seek to further undermine the stability of a legitimate government and a nation state. So I think you're seeing some of these types of dynamics in places like Libya and whatnot as well these days. So that's a big concern, not just in how we measure it, but who provides it and what that means for the sort of political stakes for nation states and governments over time. So this is an area where we need to do significantly more work, I think, in understanding what that means. We also think a lot about resilience of institutions and international cooperation in this, which again, I think is really hard to measure, but is something that I'm concerned is seeing significant strain. This is not new, but over the past decade, you've seen a lot of lack of trust coming into international organizations debating key issues like climate change and the future of nuclear weapons and things like that. I also worry about COVID and how all of these different stressors and the lack of resilience that we're seeing even within our societies in a social sense, especially in democracies like ours, what that means for things like treaty alliances, which I think we've taken for granted for a long time, that those types of systems that create the kind of international order as we see it today, we take for granted that those are strong and that they're resilient. And I think that events of recent years, including great stress from things like climate change effects, COVID, frustration about potential new nuclear arms racing and things like that. I think it's showing that our international institutions are actually probably less resilient than we would have thought they were. Whereas on the other hand, in some cases, we're seeing great social resilience kind of from the grassroots level up that we also weren't expecting and don't know how to measure that well. So it's not a neat answer to your question, but I think it's an important one. And figuring out how data plays into our understanding of resilience and how to measure and define it and include it in our work is a really important one for all of us to work on together going forward.
And Eric, I mean, I think you and Nate are saying similar things about social capital, but I was kind of struck, and FSI does point to the success of West African countries in handling Ebola. But we tend to assume that countries at the fragile end of the spectrum are by definition unable to cope with shocks. But we have seen in several respects that the Ebola response, we've seen that a lot of developing countries have really good health surveillance mechanisms. How can those positives be leveraged perhaps? How do we explain that?
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm supposed to say it's a good question, but it's a tough one. So I'll conjecture a little bit, but I think, I mean, we've derived, we started a discussion on data and we've gone to a discussion on trust, which I think is very appropriate. And, I studied community health in France. And right now, community health in France is a wish in the national public health flow. But when you talk to people on the ground, there's really very little. We've come to a very consumerist way of looking at healthcare. We have a very generous welfare state in terms of health insurance, a concept I'm happy to explain to my American colleagues. And but one of the downsides of it is we've come to a very consumerist, like we trust that public services are going to be there and provide for my health. And then it's in other sectors that local solidarities are being recreated, about concerns about climate, about having green cities, about local solidarities. But in terms of health, it tends to be very much, that's the business of these health centers. In West Africa, you know, I worked quite a bit in Mali, and I lived in Mauritania, and I love the region. But yeah, you may not have the same structures, the same, you know, infrastructure, certainly. And certainly there are plenty of challenges in terms of public service delivery. But there's also something in the social networks that is still there. And, you know, Ebola, you know, we started being able to respond to Ebola when we started saying, oh, wait a minute, didn't we used to have something like community health? And didn't we, you know, weren't people supposed to be smart and able to do stuff? Our first response was, let us take care of it. And then we failed as a global community of health experts. And then we said, oh, let's remember that this is a community issues. And of course we have a technicity. There's stuff we know about bacteria and viruses and parasites, but there's also a human capital that is there and a relational capital. And I think it's showing up again and again. The thing is, trust and relationships have a, variables, that affect a change, an outcome. They have a different phase. Like, some things happen very quickly. If there's a flood, a flash flood, it's now. Some things take a longer time. And that's part of the problem we have in our sectoral programs, is that the things that are going to make the biggest difference overall are on a long phase, a long, wave of change. Whereas the things we can do now, like we can bring doses of immunization, we can, set up immediate wash structures in a refugee camp, that we can have very rapid results. But the long term is really built on these slower processes. So, so there's a lesson here about this disconnect you're pointing to. And honestly, part of what we're, I didn't come from an emergency context or humanitarian context. I've been I've worked in some of these contexts that are considered fragile, and certainly Save the Children works a lot in that. But I've been more in the development side, building systems, looking at sustainability and resilience. And one of the lessons of my, last 4 or 5 years, working within Save, is to say that there's a lot of trends that are pushing us back towards, working in fragile contexts. Now we work on this humanitarian to development nexus, and it's not clear cut. It's not like, here you're going to do development, everything is well, you're just moving forward, and here you're fragile and it's going to go down. And for programs, for us, and my job is health system strengthening, which is a weird concept, but we're starting to ask the question, what's our responsibility as individual programs? Maybe we're mid-sized, maybe we're not a $100 million, intervention, in a country. Maybe we're a $3 to $5 or $10 million over 5 years working at 2 subnational levels. But what is our responsibility as programs of that scale for the bigger trends, the bigger variables that are captured in the FSI? I mean, and other, another tool, but in FSI, I think you have an interesting, breakdown of it. What's our responsibility in how we do the job? If we're going to improve an outcome in the next 3 years, how we do it may affect the trust, may affect the relationship between excluded and, included groups, between state and, the issues of elite captures and elite conflict. Are we achieving our results in a way that benefits the results, the ambitions, and the fragility of the state? So there is this kind of disconnect in real time that programs need to get better at. I don't think we've cracked the nut on that. I think we all try. I think our intentions are strong. I do not doubt that, but we still haven't found out the crack to say all these mid-size level interventions, how are they contributing to the bigger wave of change? And I think that's a lesson from this disconnect. Do we switch from one thing to the other, or do we build the whole? And I would say we all have to address a part of our fragility. West Africa, France, the United States, we all have things that are going to pull us down. They're different in quantification, in nature, but they all carry a strong risk for our societies.
Thanks for reinforcing that link between trust and data. And I'm going to turn to Nate for a purely data-driven question. And that's really about what do you think data might look like in the future response to a global crisis? Are there any trends that you're seeing that could prove useful and helpful?
Gotta unmute myself. Yeah, what data might look like in the future? I mean, there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done by those most directly sort of involved in trying to crack this nut that Eric was talking about. Whether it's the multilateral development banks, whether it's the regional organizations like ECOWAS, trying to find ways to use data in fragile environments to, look at, as I think was said earlier, looking at the national sort of aggregate levels, but then drilling down fractally into the subnational levels, and the kinds of tools that are being developed now. I mean, the African Development Bank has a CRFA, the Country Resilience and Fragility Assessment tool, which is really very good, which tries to sort of look at the juxtaposition between pressures across different dimensions, and then also capacities. So it's sort of taking the FSI model and then adding another level to it. The Islamic Development Bank is doing some really interesting work on resilience, trying to get to understand how to measure these very difficult sort of resilient systems. So going beyond sort of institutional capacity to look at the resilient system, so the adaptive, absorptive, and transformative capacity, and trying to use data to do that. EcoWarn, they rely sort of on two different levels. They have they have kind of a national index that they do to look at sort of structural vulnerabilities. But then they go into the field and do field research to try to drill down into how these different structural vulnerabilities may express themselves in different contexts across different stakeholder groups. And the types of data that they use for all of this, they have field monitors scattered across the region that are sending in incident reports and situation reports on a regular basis. And then, of course, just as we do with the FSI, trying to layer and triangulate that type of more dynamic, semi-structured data into sort of, along with more static types of data, and then using GIS, and then using stakeholder network analysis maps. So there's so many new tools that are being developed and so many new models. I mean, but I think that inevitably it's always going to be kind of I think I mentioned the word earlier, kind of a bit of alchemy, where you take all these different types of data and try to mix it all together and visualize it in all kinds of different ways. As IT gets more sophisticated, there's going to be a lot more sort of crowdsourced data. People are going to use more sentiment analysis of social media, but in the kinds of environments that we're talking about, countries like Somalia, countries like Nigeria, at the end of the day, it's going to be more difficult to use those kinds of sort of high-tech, types of data, and it's just more about trying to be improvisational and innovative and using the data that has always been available, and just trying to think about it in more sophisticated ways.
You might be surprised. There's an awful, when I started at Relief International 6 years ago, and went out to refugee camps. This was not that part of our work was not my background. I was really impressed that every refugee has a cell phone, or at least they've got access to one. The technology is out there. It's a question of how they're using it and how we understand their use of it. So it's not all things. They don't have access to the web, you know, in a lot of places. But they just call the internet, they call it Facebook. That's just what it's named as far as they're concerned. In this COVID pandemic in Jordan, we've pivoted our education programs. It no longer makes sense. Our staff are on lockdown. They're running their education programs on Facebook. We've got 27,000 people logging in to some of the classes. It's incredible. So we're just finding some new ways. And I think that, you know, there's Muhammad Yunus, who founded Grameen Bank, always had this expression of there's sort of the bird's eye view and then there's the worm's eye view. So in some ways, this data of the FSI is the bird's eye view, right? It takes things and it brings it up to that level. And what's great is when you have the conversation between the worm's eye view and the bird's eye view, and think about how those two things go together. So I just think that there's a lot there. I think it's a prime time, this environment, speaking of resilience, of doing community-led development, which you can do in emergency settings as well, or in fragile settings as well. It's even perhaps more important to understand what are the assets and aspirations that communities have that can shape the work that you're doing, instead of you come in with your idea of program and come and drop it on their heads. Just that very act of asking, you know, what are the strengths you already have? And often it's social relationships, but it's also knowledge. They know how to do a lot. You know, just because they are now living in very modest circumstances, if you will, doesn't mean they weren't previously an engineer running buildings somewhere, and they can actually help you fix your plumbing. So now you've got a whole skill set to tap into. So there, that aspect, and then the sense of hope and of wanting to be around for the future is unleashed. And that's probably one of the most important parts of resilience, is just that tomorrow's worth it. So let me get through today and get to tomorrow. I think that aspect is critical. That sort of, and it relates to the group grievance, right? If there's a lot of grievance, then you can have people who don't get much attention for their assets and their aspirations. But if what we can do in engaging them, yes, our objective may be education, or it may be healthcare or something like that. But if we start by saying, what are your assets and your aspirations? Where do you want to go? Then we're working with them and supporting them, reinforcing their voice, you know, adding their 2 cents into the local conversation, which then can become part of the sub-regional, regional, and so on. So I think there's a lot we can do in the how that we do our work that actually reinforces that resilience. And I mean, that's what I think is so exciting about the work that we do.
And that idea of how data can actually help to move away from cookie cutter solutions, where you become more accountable, power shifts to a certain degree to the people you're meant to be providing a service for. And for example, in a post-conflict environment, not everybody has to be a carpenter. It just introducing some kind of flexibility into that setting.
Yeah, I don't want to dismiss data, because it's also the case that you know, when we do work with communities, and particularly in a real crisis environment like this, and you see it in many places, you know, suddenly everyone walking down the street thought that they needed to have an N95 mask to protect themselves, and then you have this run on a certain kind of supply that's most essential for a certain set of very exposed health workers, and the rest of us walking down the street can do with our homemade masks. Well, equally in any environment, you see that kind of panic response. And so I think there's a role for data and education to let people know you'll be fine if you do these things. And you don't need to all have a mask, an N95 mask or whatever they might be called. But at the same time, you have to understand why they're feeling that panic. And again, I think the resilience that is going to be most important in the world that Relief International works in is getting to that food security and protection. Those are the 2 things that are going to be way more important than the best health response ever. If we don't get those 2 things right, health piece is, I won't say it won't matter, it's important, but it's just going to not really achieve the results that you want, which is a thriving community after all.
Does anybody else want to weigh in? Yes, please, Eric.
I can add one word to what Nancy just said, because I think it's very critical. You know, temperamentally, you know, our personalities, brains, culture make us more inclined to like hard data, spreadsheets, you know, square boxes, and rely on the foundation that this has and the sense of objectivity. Or we can be more artistic, and we like the social connection, the discourse, the narrative, the poetry of life. And we reach, you know, when you're looking at something like the Fragile State Index or the kind of context where Nancy, you know, works and our agencies work, we're really dealing with a lot of complexity. And just like Charles was explaining, the layers that are built into the FSI, I really like that very much, including the issue of not trusting the data without reviewing it, you know, and that old saying that what is it, that organized distrust leads to more trustworthy reports. And I think for us, dealing with the issues, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about equity, we're talking about fragility, and we're talking about changing lives in that context. It's not, you know, it's not a choice. We are dealing with complexity. And I think part of our skills must become to be a bit like we're representing on this panel, all the participants, to bring the diversity to be able to do both of the above. It's not the spreadsheet or the talking with the neighbor and doing a PRA activity. It's all of the above. And when do we need one? When do we need the other? Certainly COVID, we're not going to handle it without data. That's why we need testing. And at the same time, we're not going to even trust the numbers we're getting unless we learn to talk to each other. So it's not an either or issue. And I wanted to reinforce that point that Nancy was making.
Anybody else? If not, I'm going to, sorry, go to it's a question from YouTube, and it's to bring you, Charles, into the conversation. So I give you fair warning. I think the question's from your mum. Are there any indicators that we would look at that are more indicative or predictive of country collapse or real political risk? Try that one on for size.
Well, I think I want to say a couple of things about that. The first one is that, you know, the FSI really isn't designed as a predictive tool. It's really more of you know, it looks back over what's happened over the past year or the past several years. And so we don't want to say that the FSI is being predictive of what will happen. But at the same time, you know, it does provide, particularly looking at the indicator level scores rather than the total score. I know everyone loves to look at the total score, you know, which countries are first, second, third, but the indicator level scores really provide a very good starting point for further examination as to what might be going on in a country. And I'll just provide a couple of examples. The first one is that when the twin shocks of the Trump election and Brexit happened, we at FFP thought, you know, this was really interesting. We wonder if there was anything in the data in the years running up to these events that may have provided some sort of insight that this kind of thing was coming. And we found that actually the US and the UK were amongst the most worsened countries on our political and social cohesion indicator scores. And so that really shows that, you know, the US and the UK are often thought of, even on the index, as amongst the more stable or sustainable countries. But the change over time, particularly in these specific indicators, could have given a sense that, you know, something more was brewing underneath the surface. And the second more recent example I want to give is for Mozambique. So last year, we actually identified Mozambique as one of the 5 most worsened countries over the past decade on the FSI. And yet it really wasn't showing up as sort of a headline news event. You know, the other countries that were most worsened were countries like Yemen, Syria, Libya, Venezuela. Those you heard about in the news quite frequently, but Mozambique, not so much. And then this year you see, you know, that long-term sort of increase in pressures and in vulnerabilities really came to the surface with both their ability to respond to the 2 natural disasters that they had, and then also the emergence of a insurgency in the north of the country, as well as continued complications in their political process. So I think that while the FSI isn't predictive and there are no individual indicators that are predictive, it can provide a useful starting point, particularly at the indicator level and particularly looking at the trends in the data. It can provide a good starting point for trying to see what might be coming down the road.
Just wondering if that was across all indicators, or were there any in particular that were flashing particularly red in the case of Mozambique?
Well, I don't have the data in front of me at the moment, but I know that for the overall, amongst the most worsened over the past decade, that was for total score.
Okay. Yeah, please, Nate.
Yeah, I love this question about to what extent can the tool be used for early warning, and yes, there you can sort of pull it apart and find some indicators that tend to be more leading than others. But I like to think about sort of three different types of tools. You got your early warning tools, and the early warning tools are essentially looking for signal. They're looking to detect signals of a high probability of a given event in the future. It's not as interested in causality. It's interested in just looking at the signals of what precedes the dependent variable or the event. And you can make an excellent early warning tool. For example, if you're trying to build an early warning tool around hurricanes, and you notice that your cat always goes up on the roof and acts all crazy right before a hurricane hits, you can create an excellent early warning tool around that particular indicator of the cat behavior. But it doesn't, and it can work perfectly. It can be excellent for early warning purposes. But for response planning, it's not very helpful. I can't prevent the hurricane by keeping the cat inside the house. So if you have an early warning tool that is interested in signal detection, there's another tool which is a response planning tool. Response planning tools are interested only in indicators that you can influence with your interventions and your policies. So you're not as interested in signal detection. Leading indicators are less important to you. You want to know what you can do to influence the situation. So that's a response planning tool. The FSI is really not either one of those two. It's a diagnostic tool. So it's got your leading indicators, it's got your lagging indicators, it's got your exogenous indicators, it's got your endogenous indicators. And us as analysts, or I should say you who are in the field working on program design, and strategy, you can use the FSI, bringing your own expertise to it, and say, okay, I'm gonna use these three indicators as my leading indicators. I'm gonna use these two indicators as my sort of response planning. Those are my more, the indicators that I want to be able to influence. And so you have to bring your own expertise and then kind of feed the FSI scores into sort of your systems model. In order to develop, your response plan. So a lot of times when we talk about early warning tools, we talk about it kind of willy-nilly and broadly, and we're not very sort of clear in our heads what we mean by early warning tools. FSI is not an early warning tool, but it can be used by those who want to do early warning if they take that extra level of analysis to it.
In a similar vein, maybe a question to JJ. It's coming on Twitter, and it's a question on fragility and violence. So when does a risk become a crisis, and where should we focus our efforts?
Well, I think the question is a good one because, as I think that we see on a number of the countries that are on the very high end of the index, that fragility does not necessarily equal violence, although violence often equals fragility. And so because it is that sort of one-way causal link, I think it's really important to recognize that distinction. And so then the next question is, really, again, it gets to that predictive aspect. So when can we predict violence, for example? And I think that is one of the limitations of the data to an extent, because we can give early warning, and this is very similar to what Nate has been saying. We can give early warning that a particular country or a particular context has an increasing risk of greater instability or becoming violent in the future, but we cannot predict with any certainty that there will be a revolution next Tuesday. And so I think that just understanding those limitations is really key. Nate, I don't know if you wish to add to that.
No, I don't.
Could I add to that question with a comment and then a further question? It seems to me there's an added element, and maybe it's because I'm sort of obsessing about group grievances as an indicator. But there might be a risk, but it might not be a uniform risk across society. And so, and these are, of necessity, country level indicators. I know in my organization, we talk about fragile settings because sometimes it's a subgroup that we're working with in an otherwise less, more stable environment, but there may be a group of people where they're more at risk. So, but what I wonder is, if you see a risk in one area, could one at least draw the conclusion that if that risk is there, maybe we don't know if it's going to happen on Tuesday, but if we don't want it to happen anytime in the next 5 years, there are likely some things we could be doing, not just in this one dimension, but in some of the other dimensions that might help reduce the risk. So do you see the interplay between the indicators in some way that's relevant? I mentioned the three that we look at, the group grievance, the uneven development in the public services as being relevant to a lot that we do, but do you see a mix in that way?
Yeah, I really like how you put that. In some ways, it's kind of like you got your popcorn kernels in your pot and you're turning up the heat and you're trying to predict which popcorn kernel is going to pop first, right? And there's no way you can do that, right? I mean, but you can say that the pressure is increasing, and that over time, if the pressure continues to increase, eventually, you're going to have popcorn. So the FSI can be useful in some ways in terms of these three indicators that you mentioned. You know that when the pressure goes up in those three indicators, you're bound to have increased risk of some sort of disaster that could occur. I mean, you don't know, of all the popcorn kernels that are sitting on that fire, you have no way of knowing which one's going to pop first and which one's going to pop last just by looking at the index. But it gives you a sense.
Or an idea that we need to turn down the fire.
Absolutely.
So that's the question. What is the other variable that we can control that might help diffuse or redirect the tension?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Another way I like to think about sort of using the FSI to inform like early warning is, if you've got your structural vulnerabilities on one axis, and then you've got your maybe whatever your dependent variable is, maybe it's violence on your other axis, and you plot all the countries. Then you got 4 quadrants. So you have one quadrant where you've got low levels of violence, but high levels of structural vulnerability. And so these are countries where there's no current crisis, no one's paying any attention to it, but eventually there's going to be a shock and something terrible is going to happen and it's going to shoot into the other quadrant. You have the other quadrant where you've got low structural vulnerabilities, but you have high levels of violence. So then it tends to be oscillating. So you can look over time and you can see that, violence has tended to, fall between a certain ceiling and a certain floor. And then you have the other quadrant, which is, on an exponential escalation curve. And then you have the other, which is sustainable. And if you can use this kind of a tool, using FSI scores, to measure sort of the structural vulnerability piece, it can tell you a lot more about, what type of curve your country might be on.
Yeah, please, Eric.
So, I mean, to me, what this points to is also there's a lot of collinearity between these indicators and these domains of analysis, and that means they're going to influence each other. I mean, I can look at health indicators, say, oh, the economy is okay, but we really have a problem in the health sector, and work on that until a certain point. Once the situation is bad enough in any given sector, it's going to influence all the rest, just like we're saying with COVID. COVID disrupted a lot of things, but now COVID is going to have a huge economic impact, and that huge economic impact is going to affect a lot of things, including conflict, including elite capture, including a lot of things like this. So I think basically we're still in the middle of a 1.5 million year experiment in trying to regulate how we live on this planet. And it's, depending on how you look at it, we're making great progress, or we're really still figuring it out. And I think the value of a tool like this, which again, we probably need at different levels, is to kind of have this diagnostic and then try to, in the health sector, we try to look at resilience also. Food securities, they've got FuseNet, and FuseNet is similar. You've got big quantitative indicators that even NASA helps provide, and they're very objective and reliable across the board, and at the same time they don't mean a lot, so you need to have local teams go figure it out. So this really, this reminds me, I mean, we're in the sustainable development goal era. We are trying to move as a global community to something that's more integrated, and we need to do it more integrated because we've realized implicitly or explicitly how these things tie to each other. And so this is an attempt to have the right amount of disaggregation between one variable and the other, and at the same time trying to have some holistic diagnostic. And it's by definition going to be a flawed exercise. And I think Charles, presented the historical perspective, and we really need to build some, continuity in the measures that we have, and to try to find out what are going to be the big levers. And the thing that came to mind, where Nancy and Nate were going back and forth, is the work of Donella Meadows about where do we find the levers on systems change. And she was really looking at the ecological world, planet, environment, but we're now looking at social, technical, environmental issues, and we're still trying to find what are the levers, and we probably have more common ground than differences across these sectors. So that's part of the challenge we're dealing with now.
JJ, you want to have a word?
Yeah, I think Eric's spot on. And just one thing I would add is it's not just about, well, I mean, when we're sort of talking about planning for pandemics or, looking at vulnerabilities, it's not just looking at the data, it's also thinking about what indicators to look at. Because if you are thinking very broadly about, say, a public health crisis, a pandemic, the temptation for some might be to look at indicators like, for example, demographic pressures, looking at the general health of a country, or to look at public services, to look at the capacity of the health system, for example. But I think the current COVID-19 pandemic has really demonstrated that we also need to be looking at indicators like factionalized elites or state legitimacy when we're talking about something like a pandemic, because we have to think about the effectiveness of the response. You might be able to have the most effective, high capacity health system possible, but if your leaders can't agree on how to leverage those resources effectively and how to respond effectively to the crisis, then you're up the creek without a paddle. And so that, I think, is really, this current crisis, I think, is really demonstrating that you have to be very open-minded about the sort of data sets that you're looking at that give you the clues that you need for addressing a crisis such as this.
There's a tweeted question that kind of drills down further into that, and it also kind of applies to humanitarians as well. But given the impact of COVID-19 on the difficulty of travel, how do we collect that kind of reliable qualitative data in that kind of environment? That's to anybody. Well,
I'm sure at Relief International around the world, we've got about 7,000 people who work for us, and 97% of those people are local nationals. So we have, on the ground sentinels, if that's what you're looking for from an information standpoint. They're the ones making the calls and no longer saying, how are we doing, but saying, how are you doing? And talking about, what people can do to be prepared and to prevent infection. So we have a lot of those data sources because our staff are from those communities and working there. That part is actually sort of the least of our concerns. Getting more national data, knowing what the government's going to do, that can be harder to figure out. But at least at the community level, at the worm's eye view, we've got good eyes. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question which is back to the issue of social capital, but it approaches it from a different way. Rather than fragility, it's more that I'll just read it because I'm just garbling. Following up on Nate's point about social capital, it just clicked off. Yes, following up on Nate's point about social capital, is there anything in the data that might predict whether the pandemic will strengthen or weaken illiberal regimes like Hungary, Poland, Brazil, and the Philippines? And I won't repeat what they've said about President Trump. I think that's to Nate, perhaps, or anybody.
Oh,
yes, please,
I'd be happy to. Yeah, this is one of our huge concerns. And if you look at histories of the rise of nationalist sentiment in illiberal regimes, a lot of the ingredients that preceded those times you see manifesting today, that occurred before COVID, but very often this added type of stressor will push some of these trends over the line. It also takes back, so building on the conversation from earlier and bringing in this, you're talking about the limited predictive capability of these types of data sets, but they're much more helpful with prevention. So you could use FSI and other things like this, along with other sources, to know in particular when you really need to deploy diplomatic resources from various countries or international organizations to try to help curtail some of these really dangerous trends that you're seeing, or work with allies in how to build kind of a buffer against things like rising illiberalism or ultranationalism in the negative ways that those can manifest in terms of security and conflict trends and within societies. COVID, based on just the nature of pandemics and these things, like many other types of extreme disasters, you could see that walking back our ability to even conduct normal diplomacy in some cases, and things like that can help rein in some of those trends that are so worrisome. I'm watching Brazil very carefully on this. Again, the sort of rise of some of these trends definitely preceded COVID. I would have expected COVID in that case to be strengthening some of those trends, and we're actually seeing it undermine some of them. So it's just a reminder that for all of these, you have to look at different things case by case. COVID and some of these other trends, climate change impacts and whatnot, they're not going to universally strengthen or weaken trends the same way country by country. It's going to manifest differently. But that said, as some of the data presented earlier indicated, we are seeing troubling signs regarding trends in democracies already and rising nationalism and whatnot. We know historically that those can end in very bad events and crises that manifest. So I think for us, we look to these type of data and pair it for questions just like the one posed on Twitter and say where is it best to deploy new acts of diplomacy and new partnership types of approaches that might help rein in some of the dangerous trends that we see manifesting from those types of things.
So the importance of trends rather than specific cases. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, there's another question, if you don't mind me going through step by step or one by one. It's again about the reliability of data, and it's a specific country, Eritrea. As we know, it's rather closed. So the question is, how do you gather data from countries like Eritrea? where there are restrictions. How would we go about that?
I'm happy to take that, and Charles, feel free to weigh in additionally, or Nate as well. But we often get this question with a number of countries that are relatively closed. Eritrea is one. Traditionally, the country we get asked about the most in this regard is North Korea. And from the perspective of the different data streams that we leverage, we're able to take advantage of the fact that a lot of the data that we are analyzing is by virtue external. So some of the quantitative data that we utilize is from institutions like the World Bank and the UN and so forth, who generally don't have too many problems in gaining that sort of quantitative data from member countries. Where we could potentially run into problems is on the qualitative data, so on the content analysis. But the way in which we conduct the content analysis, as Charles mentioned during his presentation, was that we apply content analysis to roughly about 10,000 different data sources. Many of them are external, and there is still external reporting on countries even as closed as Eritrea and North Korea. So to that extent, we have not had too many challenges. If we were reliant entirely on information coming from the countries themselves, we might be a little bit more hamstrung. We have actually had countries who have approached us and offered to provide us with their own data. And although that's a very generous offer, we've chosen to decline it for obvious reasons of objectivity. But as I say, we haven't found that it's provided too much of a challenge just because our catchment is so broad. Charles or Nate, if you wish to follow up.
Yeah, sure. So I'll say a little something. I think this is sort of related to a challenge that we have to face more broadly than even just countries that are particularly closed, which is that sometimes, particularly for the quantitative data, you know, I spoke about it being sometimes a little bit lagging, and this may be worse in countries like Eritrea or North Korea, but is certainly something that can affect all the countries that we're looking at, even from institutions like the World Bank. And so one of the things that we have to think about when we're incorporating data like that is what's the trade-off between using data that may, you know, be a few years old or even more than a few years old. What's the trade-off between it being out of date versus it still providing some sort of useful information to us? And so one of the ways that we think about that is, you know, how much would we expect a given metric to change rapidly year on year? You know, there are some metrics that could change very quickly, things like government budgets or unemployment figures, versus there are some metrics that really change much more slowly, things like literacy rates or arable land. And so those, even if the metrics that change slowly like that, or even if they're a couple of years out of date or more than that, they can still provide some really useful information in building our picture of a given country. Whereas for metrics that change really, or can change fairly quickly from year to year, we have to be much more careful about using metrics like that may be a couple of years outdated, because they really can provide a misleading picture of what the country looks like today.
I would just follow up by saying that I think that is why taking a triangulated approach to data is so incredibly important, because we're not reliant on one particular data stream. We're looking at qualitative, we're looking at quantitative, and having that triangulation basically reinforces every data stream's reliability in the whole. And I think that makes the critical difference.
Maybe as we start to reflect on more on the impact of this year's scores, FSI, what do you think, and this is to anybody and everybody, what do you think policymakers and civil society organizations should take away from this year's scores? What do you think the biggest takeaways are for the public?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways that we often see in the Fragile States Index is, as much as there are often stories of doom and gloom, really at the high level, the world is getting better. And I think particularly as we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly when you're on week 7 or week 8 or week 9 or who knows, week 27 by this point of a lockdown, there does tend to be that negative sense, almost an end of days feeling. But it's important to use data, to leverage data to understand that actually, in reality, the world is getting better. We measure 178 countries. In the 2020 Fragile States Index, only 21 of them got worse than last year. So that means that we are judged 88% of the countries as getting better. Even if that's just a marginal improvement, they're still getting better. And I think that at that high level, that is one of the key takeaways, that yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to see increased pressures and worsening in a number of countries in the 2021 FSI. But in general, if you look at the long-term trend, countries are improving and countries are doing much better than they did before.
I would build on what JJ just said and say that beyond that, it shows us that we have a responsibility to try to continue that trend for all of us who work in various aspects of global affairs and even in our local communities and countries. One of the things that things like the FSI show in the big picture is that we can't pretend that we don't understand in a really detailed way. Even with all the things that we don't understand and can't predict, we have so much information on how the world is shaping up and how certain trends and threats are manifesting and where change is occurring and how that change is occurring. And we have an absolute responsibility to use all that data and information that's available when we think about how to prepare for a more resilient future and for handling specific threats and problems that we see coming down the pike. And we have, for our organization, I know we use resources like this as that constant reminder to be optimistic, including in the ways that JJ just mentioned, but also as that reminder that we have tools that even 5, 10, 20 years ago, we couldn't have dreamed of bringing to problem solving in global affairs. So we always take that grander view of it, a different form of optimism that the data should remind us just how much we know and how much information is at our fingertips to help guide our work and make it more effective.
I would also add to that there's a certain issue of where the burden lies here. Because you can have the best data, you can have the most reliable, most accurate data set, looking at the widest variety of different aspects of a country. But you also need to, on the other hand, recognize that there is a burden on policymakers to use that data effectively. And insofar as we can all create fantastic data sets that are able to paint an intricately detailed picture of a country, if policymakers are not prepared to use that data effectively, to take data-based approaches to policymaking, and then to make effective policy, then the data is not going to be helpful. It's a little bit an analogy I would draw is a bit like surgery. You can have the finest tools, you can have the finest methods, but if the doctor is not even willing to see the patient or even willing to accept that the patient has a problem, then that surgery is not going to happen and the tools are going to be fairly worthless. So I think that data is fairly similar. We can have fantastic data, but you've also got to be willing to use it, and you've also got to be willing to make informed policy on it.
Sorry, Josh, or?
No, I'm just happy to, I think we're getting close to wrapping up, so I'm happy to wrap up now, if that.
Well, if I could finish off then with also a sort of hopeful story. We've done a lot of work in Myanmar, and Myanmar is not very high on the index. I've got the number here somewhere, number 22, or too high, depending on which way you look at it. But one of the areas that we've worked a lot on is health access in South Shan State, and particularly for some of the minority ethnic groups. And so this is a classic case of sort of group grievance or group disconnection, and people just not having much trust in the healthcare system. So there was a healthcare system, but they wouldn't go to it. So the intervention ended up being to work with those communities to give them some of the health tools so that they could become better consumers of health. This is largely around labor and delivery. But then also just make sure that they met with and did some bridge building exercises with the local health institutions so that when a labor delivery needed additional care, they had the confidence and the connections to be able to go and take advantage of those other health resources. Those relationships now turn out to be really important when it comes to something new like a pandemic, that you've got those relationships, you've got the trust, you've got the vocabulary to talk about health, to talk about their communities, and now you can talk about the pandemic. If you'd had the pandemic come along before those relationships existed, you wouldn't have had any way to connect, and you'd have just had increased vulnerability instead of the opportunity of decreasing vulnerability. So I just think it's just looking at some of these ways in which, again, I go on about the group grievance and the interconnection with public services, but I think these are just really important for the communities that Relief International works with, and addressing the particular vulnerabilities that they have. And it also gets to that point of not just seeing the information for how to react later, but what does that help you do now? Put things in place so that you're not so vulnerable down the road. And sometimes we can't change a whole country, but we can at least work with some of the most vulnerable communities and move them up the curve so that they can have better access to the goods and services that they need. So thank you.
Maybe just one last thing, because Nancy kind of triggered that thinking. Recently, we looked at how our project that had worked in emergency settings, that was Pakistan and Yemen, and how they, Pakistan and Sudan, and we'd looked at, where they kind of moved towards system strengthening, more sustainable approaches and things. And one of the optimistic things that we found is that even in very hard settings, and in some of these settings, we were working on family planning, which is not always the easiest thing to approach. The local change that even, mid-sized, small interventions can have, can resonate, can bring to decision makers, data that shows you can move, bringing hope to decision makers, kind of a theory X, theory Y picture of things can change, things can improve. It's possible to kind of build the snowballing from local change, get local results. You want both levels working, but we can't neglect the value and impact of making change locally with local constituents and having that be part of the signal to the decision makers that are going to be looking at an index like the FSI. So thank you.
Okay. George, can I hand over to you?
Sure,
Any chance?
by all means. And first, thank you very much to all our panelists who did participate today, and to everybody who is joining us online and through YouTube. Very much appreciate your participation today. One of the things that I stress, and I know we believe strongly at the Fund for Peace, is working collaboratively with people in this space is one of the most important things that we do and stress and want to encourage. We are all, in essence, working toward the same objective. And so whether we're coming from the health field or whether we're coming directly from the humanitarian field or the peace building field, it is really important, I think, to have this kind of collaboration, and I appreciate that. And I just note, and as I was thinking through this, one of the things that really struck me was in December, I was surprised, or maybe not surprised, that dictionary.com identified the word existential as the word of the year for 2019. And I think that reflected a growing sort of sense of the magnitude of the impacts of climate change, the sort of some of the reports that came out last year about the destruction and really the extinction that is happening in large elements of the biosphere. It was an overall sense that we have just become more fragile and more at risk. I think that's important for us at the Fund for Peace to think about, because all of these things, these existential risks that we've been talking about, and some of which are captured in the FSI, are really threats to peace at large, conflict. And our mission is really to, and as I know it is the mission of everybody who is really participating today, to think about how we manage those risks, how we alleviate those risks, how we bring capacity to respond to those risks. I mean, that is really our fundamental mission together. And one thing that I heard today from many, many people was, and we certainly believe that the FSI, the Fragile State Index, is really just one tool in a big toolbox that many people in this area can pick up, use, put together with other tools, and ultimately become real peace builders and peacemakers at the end of the day. So having this conversation, I hope, is yet one more step in continuing to burnish those tools, make them aware, and get them in the hands of as many people as possible. So thank you all for your participation very much. We look forward to doing this perhaps in person together next year, but if not, a virtual gathering again. So again, thank you very much on behalf of the Fund for Peace.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.